Good evening and welcome to Yale Divinity School Summer Study 2026. And more specifically, welcome to the summer's keynote address by Professor Yii-Jan Lin entitled American Apocalypse Now. My name is Jan Hagens. I'm part of the summer study team at Yale Divinity School and Yale University at large, which consists of our Office of Communications, that's Brock Harmon and Tom Krattenmaker, of our Center for Continuing Education, that's Kelly Morrissey and Megan Lukens, and the Yale Provou Center for Teaching and Learning, that's Belinda Platt. So my thanks go to all of these colleagues, and of course to our wonderful faculty of summer study, who are the people who make summer study possible. And now it's my great pleasure to present to you our keynote speaker for tonight, Professor Yii-Jan Lin. Professor Lin specializes in immigration, textual criticism, the revelation of John, race, and gender. Tonight's talk will, I'll assume, be based on her book, Immigration and Apocalypse, How the Book of Revelation Shaped American Immigration, that came out with Yale University Press in 2024, and focuses on the use of Revelation in political discourse surrounding American immigration. Her book before that, with the ingenious title, The Erotic Life of Manuscripts, came out with Oxford in 2016, and that one examines how metaphors of race, family, evolution, and genetic inheritance have shaped the goals and assumptions of New Testament textual criticism from the 18th century to the present. Professor Lin has been published in journals such as the Journal of Biblical Literature, Early Christianity, TC, a Journal of Biblical Textual Criticism. She's co-chair of the Minoritized Criticism and Biblical Interpretation section of the Society for Biblical Literature, on the steering committee for the Ethnic Chinese Biblical Colloquium, and on the steering committees for the New Testament Textual Criticism and the Bible in America sections of SBL, Society for Biblical Literature. She serves on the editorial board of the Journal for Biblical Literature, and she's a member of the Society of Asian Biblical Studies, the European Association of Biblical Studies, and an elected member of Studiorum Novi Testamenti Societas. Audiences are always interested in a scholar's academic pedigree, and Professor Lin has covered it all from West Coast to East Coast. She started at Pomona College with a BA in English Literature, then an MA from the University of Chicago, again in English Literature, but also an MA in New Testament Studies from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, also in Illinois. And then she came to Yale to get her PhD in New Testament Studies. For tonight's keynote address, Professor Lin will speak for about 40 minutes actually, and she has agreed that we will then have some Q&A. So feel free to submit questions to the Q&A submission box at the bottom of your screen during Professor Lin's talk, and of course immediately after, so those we can then integrate into the Q&A and maybe hopefully have a conversation about what should be a topic of theological and current importance to all of us. So without further ado, Professor Lin's lecture on American Apocalypse Now. Yii-Jan, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. So thank you for joining me this evening. And I would like to thank the Offices of Continuing Education and Communication and Summer Study for inviting me to give this talk. I'm going to be speaking tonight on topics that have had a lot of airtime within the last year. So that is, I will be speaking on immigration and on the use of the Bible on issues of immigration. Now, when I bring up the Bible and religion and its relatedness to immigration, you may immediately think of religious leaders who have spoken up about how we should treat immigrants and refugees. You may think of the Reverend Marianne Buddy, who urged Trump at his inauguration church service to have mercy on immigrants. Or you may be reminded of the late Pope Francis, who declared that an authentic rule of law is verified precisely in the dignified treatment that all people deserve, especially the poorest and the most marginalized. But I'm not here to talk about that kind of biblical interpretation for immigration. That is the use of ethical principles and teachings found in the Bible to instruct us how to treat each other. I'm here to talk about something much more bizarre, which is the use of biblical apocalyptic literature in the realm of US politics and immigration. You're probably all familiar with the term apocalyptic, and especially familiar with the current popular and increasingly fitting sense of the word, which describes the disastrous and the catastrophic, things that are world ending. This popular meaning of the term derives from the ancient Greek word apocalypsis, which means an unveiling or a revelation. For biblical scholars, apocalyptic refers to a kind of ancient writing that reveals something, usually divine visions, heavenly or hellish realms, end of world events such as floods, and the rise of demonic superpowers, eclipses, the kinds of things that are depicted on this slide. In the Christian Bible, there are numerous apocalyptic passages, but the most popular text that comes to mind in terms of Christian apocalypse is the book of Revelation, the last book of the Christian Bible. In fact, all the artwork that I pulled for this slide are based on verses in Revelation: the four horsemen, the lake of burning fire in the middle, and the destruction of the great whore of Babylon on the right-hand side. So the text of Revelation is not the usual biblical text we think of when we think of immigration issues or Christians arguing about politics or public policy. End of days predictions with celestial cities and angels and demons are not what people consider part of the political rhetoric. It might make for fantastic movies and dystopian novels, but for its long 2,000-year-old history, the book of Revelation has been sort of an embarrassment to mainline Christians and a joke to non-Christians because it's been the obsession of cults and doomsday hoarders and other groups that are tucked into the hidden corners of society. But if you've been paying attention to certain news items, especially if you're already familiar with the biblical text or its imagery, you'll know that certain images and verses from Revelation and other apocalyptic biblical texts are appearing in political rhetoric, sometimes through imagery, sometimes metaphorically, but oftentimes explicitly and also understood in literal ways. Apocalyptic end times prophecies and talk about demons actually do appear in speeches, interviews, and media of the most powerful in the US government and in corporations. So exhibit A of this is Peter Thiel. He's venture capitalist. He's well-known founder of PayPal, as well as Palantir, the infamous data analysis and surveillance firm, and a foundational investor in Anduril, a defense company focusing on creating autonomous AI-driven weapons and surveillance technology. He's also been a supporter and a financial backer of Donald Trump. And he has, as you see here, delivered a series of lectures on the Antichrist, a figure that appears in a few end times prophecies of the Christian New Testament, a powerful figure that spreads lies and deceives the world. Thiel is a self-professed Christian and has stated that he thinks ancient prophecies may help us understand current geopolitics. He doesn't just mean this figuratively, and his interpretations of the Bible don't just end with prayer, church coffee hour, and volunteering at a soup kitchen. He and Trey Stevens, co-founder of Anduril, are involved in the same church in San Francisco, Epic Church, and they invest in tech like autonomous drones and border surveillance in the service of ideas of who is the Antichrist. Surprise, it's not them. And in the service of their biblical interpretations of what global danger is and how humanity should overcome them. Their theology and their apocalyptic understanding directly fuels the weapon and technology used at the US-Mexico border. For example, Anduril has created and built 300 autonomous surveillance towers along the border for US Customs and Border Patrol. And so for Trey Stevens, this technology is a direct product of his theology. He states, "We're doing it because we believe it's just and moral." And he goes on to say that, like Oppenheimer, his work is also, quote, "accepting the fate of the divine in the execution of justice," end quote. This is where he says God is pointing him. So men like Trey Stevens and Peter Thiel have multiple ties to others in Silicon Valley and the US government faith and funding club. Thiel and Stevens, along with men like Elon Musk, Mark Andreessen, Curtis Yarvin, and Balaji Srinivasan, all subscribe to visions of a technocratic world in which the quote-unquote non-reproductive members of society need to be eliminated and a new heaven and earth come from after the total destruction of our current world. Srinivasan, the former chief technology officer of Coinbase, casts his vision of what he calls the network state in distinctly biblical and apocalyptic terms. He says, quote, "You can found a tribe just like you can found a startup. That's what Abraham did. That's what Jesus did. What I'm really calling for is something like tech Zionism," end quote. So these techno-fascists are not innovating to prevent biblical apocalypse, but are instead counting on it. Exhibit B of apocalyptic biblical text in public discourse is this, a post by Donald Trump on Truth Social. He posted this on the day the indictment in the classified documents case was unsealed summer of 23. "The seal has been broken," he declares in all caps. And he goes on to promise judgment and destruction on the wicked and to swear vengeance on his enemies. Trump here specifically uses the language of Revelation in a play on words. He is echoing Revelation chapter 6, when the Lamb of God breaks the seal on the heavenly scroll to unleash the four horsemen of the apocalypse who bring destruction and judgment. So this is the verse from Revelation about the breaking of the first seal. "Then I saw the Lamb break one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures call out as with a voice of thunder, 'Come!' And I looked, and there was a white horse. Its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer." Now, you may wonder if Trump actually knows this passage from Revelation and is purposefully making an allusion. So judging from what I've observed, I'd say probably not. It's more likely that someone on his team is crafting this play on imagery. But it doesn't matter whether he has intention or not, who wrote the post. The result is that Trump's followers are making this connection between the seal being broken in this Truth Social post and Revelation's prophecies. So if you simply search for Trump on a white horse, you will find the conquering rider of Revelation 6 in artwork and posters and on Trump's own digital playing cards. The apocalyptic language coming from the White House and other government leaders is a clear rallying cry to right-wing Christians who know their Bible and believe the book of Revelation. For example, far-right Pastor Lance Wallnau declared that, quote, "God's hand is on Trump and he cannot be stopped." Others have called him God's anointed and declared US political clashes a battle between cosmic good and evil. And finally, there's Exhibit C. And I'm going to show you a recruitment ad for US Customs and Border Patrol posted on X by the Department of Homeland Security in last July. It's about a minute long, so I'm going to go ahead and play it. So what you heard was the voice of Shia LaBeouf from the movie Fury, in which he plays an American tank gunner in World War II, from a scene in which the tank crew are about to be slaughtered by an oncoming German battalion. The Bible verse LaBeouf quotes is Isaiah 6:8, in which the prophet Isaiah has a vision and pledges to fulfill God's mission. The music interspliced is a folk song, "God's Gonna Cut You Down," which has been famously covered by Johnny Cash, not the version here, with lyrics promising God's eventual destruction of the wicked. This mixture of glorified martyrdom, apocalyptic vision, judgment, vengeance, and violent masculinity makes for what I must say is a very effective recruitment ad. This is exactly the kind of full-throttle righteous fury, sniper night vision fantasy the CBP likes. And their agents have been on record through their entire history saying that they feel they are part of a religious brotherhood on a holy mission. So where is all of this coming from? Why do we see such a confluence of biblical apocalyptic and US politics, particularly with regards to immigration? The full history of the relationship between America and the book of Revelation is the subject of my book, Immigration and Apocalypse. But without going into that entire story tonight, I suggest three themes from the book of Revelation that have been recycled through centuries to shape American immigration ideology. The first is the theme of chosenness. In Revelation, only those chosen and destined belong to the heavenly city of God, and only the chosen 144,000 are specially sealed as God's saints. This chosenness is predetermined by God, so a person can't achieve that status, but simply is chosen. This becomes an essential part of their being, not something that they can achieve. So this concept can easily become tied to essential ideas of race and ethnicity. We see this in the way people groups have claimed divine chosenness theologically. And this is what we see in the rhetoric now of white Christian nationalists who claim an essential identity as God's people. And this chosen rhetoric of MAGA comes from a long line of radicalized and religious thinking intimately tied to American exceptionalism, which understands the entire nation as God's chosen country and is particularly holy and protected by God. We can see this religious American exceptionalism in the preaching of the Puritan colonizers who claimed America as God's city, the Theopolis Americana, or the recruiting of civil war that broke out and that spoke of Zion. And we can especially see the rhetoric of divine chosenness in Ronald Reagan's habit of calling the US a shining city on a hill, which comes from the New Testament in Matthew and signals the city of Jerusalem and also the shining city of the heavenly New Jerusalem that descends in the book of Revelation. America is equated with the New Jerusalem that descends, and metaphorically and literally in political speeches and sermons through the centuries. And people of America, true Americans, become equated with an exclusive group, a chosen people, with a chosen leader like Trump, who is seen as God's anointed. This chosenness then grants the justification for excluding people who are deemed essentially not American and not chosen. This leads me to the second concept of Revelation influencing US immigration, and that is the concept of the damned. The damned, the divinely condemned, are the opposite of the chosen. These are the great mass of humans on earth who are not divinely chosen and who suffer God's wrath in Revelation through plagues, floods, famine, earthquakes, and other catastrophes. At the judgment of the dead, they are condemned for destruction, and they cannot enter the heavenly New Jerusalem. They are shut out of its walls and gates. We are given very specific descriptions in the text of who they are. Revelation 22:15 reads, "Outside are the dogs and sorcerers and sexually immoral and murderers and idolaters and everyone who practices falsehood." So notice the type of descriptions at play here. The damned and God's enemies are likened to animals practicing secret occult deeds who are sexually corrupting, violent, and unchristian. These strategies of describing those excluded are also mirrored in the rhetoric of Trump and his administration in describing immigrants. These are labels that Trump uses against immigrants, which he calls diseased, animals, not human, drug dealers, rapists, violent, those who, quote, don't like our religion. He famously declared in the presidential candidates debate that invasive immigrants are eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, spreading the false claim that Haitian immigrants in Ohio were stealing and eating household pets. Revelation also describes God's enemies as consuming the unspeakable and drinking the blood of dead bodies. This apocalyptic language to describe immigrants is not new. You can find identification of unwanted peoples with rats, disease, murderers, and idol worship, and with eating disgusting foods throughout American history. In fact, the first federally enforced immigrant exclusion laws, which were aimed at Chinese immigrants, were based on exactly this kind of rhetoric in Senate debates in the US. US senators described Chinese peoples as essentially pagan and a threatening horde, while popular media equated them with pests, eating rats, and corrupting white Americans sexually while threatening to cut their throats. This set of vocabulary from Revelation is endlessly recyclable and politically effective. You'll see from these two concepts I've spoken of so far, that of a chosen people and a chosen country as versus those who are damned, involve extreme language and categorization of peoples. And this is the third concept of Revelation that feeds immigrant rhetoric, which is end times absolutes. The events and themes of Revelation deals in extreme absolutes. It depicts, after all, final events like the destruction of the earth and the judgment of the dead, whereas the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels and the letters of Paul and others in the rest of the New Testament offers ethical instruction open to multiple applications in society. But Revelation itself lends itself to extremism. At the judgment of the dead, there's no debate about forgiveness or mercy. Souls are welcomed within the walls of the New Jerusalem, or they're cast into the lake of burning fire. The finality of end times demands absolutes, and it closes possibilities. And I would say this is the key reason Revelation and apocalyptic thinking is so well embraced by Trump and his administration and others in American history, because it allows for definitive, extreme language, absolute urgency, and total justification. In the light of the lake of burning fire, there's no time to debate ethics or legal complexities. Those who claim to be God's chosen and hold the seat of power get to make absolute and extreme judgments about who belong and who don't. Binding these three concepts together, the concepts of chosenness, damnation, and absolutism, is the sheer drama and spectacle of the book of Revelation. Not only are its themes extreme, so is its imagery. It describes rivers and oceans turning to blood. The whore of Babylon is seated on a 10-headed beast, and in its final chapters, the New Jerusalem, larger than the size of India, descends with crystal walls that reach up into space. Those heavenly walls became a perfect symbol for Trump's first presidential campaign and a major cornerstone of his immigration policy in his first term. It embodies all the themes I've discussed, serving as a physical dividing line separating those inside from out. The rhetoric arguing for the construction of barrier walls continues the conceptualization of America as the heavenly New Jerusalem in literal terms, with walls and gates like the heavenly city. This pro-wall language and the legal sections made for wall building reflect a culminating understanding of America as God's city in the most extreme mode, relying on biblical justification that apocalyptic times call for apocalyptic measures. For example, Lara Logan, once a chief foreign correspondent for CBS, now a strident critic of what she calls mainstream media, appears on Newsmax in October 22. Logan stated as a matter of fact that, quote, God knows that the open border is Satan's way of taking control of the world through all these peoples who are his stooges and his servants. Similarly, a month after Donald Trump's first inauguration in February 2017, the Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC, hosted a panel titled, If Heaven Has a Gate, a Wall, and Extreme Betting, Why Can't America? In 2019, Steve King, who was a congressman of Iowa at the time, tweeted, Heaven has a wall, a gate, and a strict immigration policy. Hell has open borders. And after Florida Governor Ron DeSantis in 23 signed SB 1718 into law, it's a highly restrictive immigration bill, Florida Congresswoman Keon Michael proclaimed before the State House of Representatives, Heaven has borders, hell has none. The Reverend Robert Jeffress, Southern Baptist pastor and Trump campaigner, went on Fox and Friends in 2018 and stated, walls are not unchristian. The Bible says even heaven is going to have a wall around it. Not everyone's going to get in. And he was cheered on by his hosts, one of whom was Pete Hegseth, now the U.S. Secretary of War. The Reverend Jeffress does not equate the United States and heaven, but he assumes that America is modeled on it. And the heaven he invokes clearly comes from the description of the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21, the walled-in destination of the holy saints after the final judgment. But can concrete slabs or steel fencing along the U.S.-Mexico border resemble the bejeweled walls of the New Jerusalem? The language that wall proponents, and especially Trump, has used echoes several main themes of the description we find in Revelation 21, which describes the city as like jasper, clear as crystal, with a great high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels. And on the gates are inscribed the names of the 12 tribes of the Israelites. The description in Revelation is one of the most detailed passages in New Testament, but four major themes about the wall stand out. It is big, it is beautiful, it is clear, and it has gates. The measurements of the New Jerusalem are massive, 12,000 stadia by 12,000 stadia, or in US measurements, 1,500 miles by 1,500 miles, almost 2/3 the geographic area of the United States. I pulled this from a blog post by someone who created a 2-scale cubic city of the New Jerusalem and how big it would be on the globe. So even more bizarre is the mention that the angel also measures the height of the city at 1,500 miles, indicating this other worldly type of wall, which would stretch beyond the Earth's atmosphere. But the bizarre measurements imply that a literal realization of the wall is not the point. These walls are not practical or even functional in human imagination. Their description is not a blueprint with practical architectural details, but rather a descriptive passage using architectural rhetoric. This gigantic, impenetrable 1,500-mile-high wall of the New Jerusalem communicate not just infinite security and protection, but also theologically, politically, and ideologically, the omnipotence of the God who created these walls and the absolute inclusion and exclusion effected by God's judgment. In similar and repetitive speech, Trump has described his wall throughout his first campaign and presidency, consistently dwelling on just how big the wall would be by using specific numbers. Over and over again, Trump claimed that the wall would stretch 1,000 miles long. He also stressed how high in feet the wall would stand, sometimes 50 feet tall, sometimes 30 feet. The inconsistency of the measurements did not matter. Neither did the fact that Trump's imagined wall was structurally and economically ridiculous. The measurements were and are symbolic, just as they are for the New Testament, the New Jerusalem. The numbers are vast and whole and repeated, drummed into the ears of the faithful. So they believe Trump's authority and ability to build the wall, sealing off America as the New Jerusalem. Beyond big, 1,000 miles long, and 50 feet high, the other main descriptor Trump used to describe the wall was beautiful. Again and again, Trump referred to a big, beautiful wall. And perhaps his vocabulary is limited, or perhaps he enjoys this alliteration, or perhaps he just likes the word, but Trump's emphasis on beautiful went beyond slapping a pretty veneer on an ugly dividing line. For one thing, Trump felt that anything that bore his name should be beautiful. I want it to be beautiful, he said, because maybe someday they'll call it the Trump wall. Maybe, so I have to make sure it's beautiful, right? So Trump's language of a beautiful wall made its way into the wider discourse, even affecting the language of U.S. Customs and Border Protection when they commissioned 8 companies to build prototypes for the border wall. We'll be looking at aesthetics, stated CBP acting deputy commissioner, leading with the beauty of each prototype. And once the 8 prototypes had been revealed to the general public, a nonprofit organization named MAGA petitioned to preserve the prototypes as a national monument, stating that they have, quote, significant cultural value and are historical land art. People love a spectacle. The walls of the New Jerusalem and in Trump's speeches stand big and beautiful, no matter their immateriality and their existence partly or solely in the imagination. The words describing them, gleaming with jewels or barbed wire, stretching out thousands of miles, awe and provoke, inspire, and simply entertain. More importantly, for the faithful audience of Revelation and of Trump's speeches, the awesomeness of the walls raises excitement, inspires emotions of triumph, vindication, and pride. And Trump knew this. During the run-up to the 2016 election, he told the New York Times about his strategy for working up his audience at campaign rallies. He said, if it gets a little boring, if I see people starting to sort of maybe think about leaving, I can sort of tell the audience, I just say, we will build a wall, and they go nuts. Adding to the spectacle of the New Jerusalem is the incredible light that emanates from it. The entire city glows with the glory of God who dwells within. And this radiance shines not just outward from the city, but through the city walls. Revelation 21:11 reads, the city has the glory of God and a radiance like a very rare jewel, like jasper, clear as crystal. The reader can imagine the New Jerusalem not just as strong, enormous, and beautiful, but also as transparent, with the brilliance of the divine shining through the entire edifice. Incredibly, this detail also figures prominently in Trump's description of his border wall. After receiving Border Patrol feedback regarding his giant concrete wall, Trump added that his wall would not only be big and beautiful, but also see-through. He said, one of the things with the wall is you need transparency. You have to be able to see through it because you have to see what's on the other side of the wall. When they throw a large sack of drugs over and you have people on the other side of the wall, you don't see it. They hit you on the head with 60 pounds of this stuff, it's over. And of course, Trump and the Border Patrol required a transparent or see-through wall, not to magnify the divine radiance of America, the shining city on a hill, but for purposes of surveillance. Radiant light does really shine from the US at the border wall. It is the light of vigilantes and guards and the light of surveillance. And in fact, lighting the wall began long before Trump's political career. In 1990, a California group calling itself the Alliance for Border Control organized a monthly protest called Light Up the Border. So in order to deter border crossing immigrants, members of the group parked hundreds of cars along the border to shine their headlights together into Mexico. And a few years later, in order to surveil a large surge of immigration at the border due to the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, the Clinton administration set up stadium lights along the wall, shining them into Tijuana as part of Operation Gatekeeper. And these are not the only lights shining at the border. Thanks to men like Peter Thiel and Trey Stevens, sensor lights, infrared, and backscatter lights also beam their rays, creating a barrier of watchfulness against intruders. Naturally, guards also watch the borders and gates, like the 12 angels at the 12 gates of the New Jerusalem. And this is not just fanciful and extended comparison on my part. In 1986, the organization Civilian Material Assistance, a group including Vietnam veterans, Ku Klux Klan members, and ultra-conservative Birchers, dispatched 20 vigilantes to the border, calling them border angels. It's the heavenly language of revelation creeps into every corner of immigration, border, and walls. Despite the dangers lurking outside the walls, the New Jerusalem Wall has gates, 12 in number, each of them made up from a single enormous pearl. Although the city is enclosed by this imposing wall, it's not sealed from the outside. In fact, these 12 gates remain open at all times because they, quote, will never be shut by day and there will be no night there. Revelation 21 says that. And Trump also conceded in his first presidency that there must be a gate in his wall. In fact, he stated that the border wall would have a very big, very beautiful door. Revelation's description of God's city gives details not only of the gates, but also those allowed and actively entering the gates. And Trump and the US government had, for as long as borders have been enforced in American history, agreed with Revelation that those who may enter the open gates without question are those who bring tribute to enrich the city, whether as individuals or as nations through trade agreements. Trump states, quote, "This will be a wall with a very big, very beautiful door because we want the legals to come back into the country," end quote. The type of legals to whom Trump and his administration want to open that beautiful door to were people of talent, they say. In the same vein, former ICE director and now current border czar Tom Homan wrote in 2020 that the Trump administration's vision of desirable immigrants would be those of, quote, "extraordinary talent, professional and specialized vocations, exceptional academic track records," end quote. During Trump's first term, America remained open to those outside so long as they brought with them prosperity, privilege, and the promise of wealth. But now, in Trump's second term, the ideology is changing, although the themes stay the same. Instead of welcoming in wealth, Trump has touted tariffs as America's vengeance against the world for economic grievances. And while the wall is still being built, in fact, Trump is now bulldozing through protective Texas wildlife for wall construction. The rhetoric has shifted to ICE capture, mass deportation, and detention centers like Alligator Alcatraz and CICOT in El Salvador. The vocabulary has moved on from this big, beautiful wall and focuses now on the idea of invasion and the necessity of expulsion. From the beginning of his last presidential campaign, Trump has been decrying the invasion and takeover of American cities by what he says are millions upon millions of illegal immigrants. The fear of immigrant invasion is not new in US rhetoric on immigration. So in the lead up to the Chinese exclusion laws of 1880 onwards, lawmakers, newspapers, and literature all sounded the alarm of an invading Chinese horde. In 1877, the San Francisco satirical magazine The Wasp ran a cartoon titled Uncle Sam's Farm in Danger. This cartoon participated in the fear-mongering against Chinese refugees fleeing the northern Chinese famine of 1876 to 79. In it, Chinese immigrants are drawn as a literal pest in the form of a plague. The Chinese are depicted as a biblical plague of locusts, particularly the plague described in Revelation 9, which covers the earth after the fifth trumpet of God is blown. Like the apocalyptic locusts, the Chinese insects have faces like human faces, and their braids are like women's hair, and they simultaneously resemble tails like scorpions with stingers, and they stick straight out of the backs of their heads like an insect's appendage. Further linking the cartoon to the apocalyptic imagery of Revelation is the demonic figure of famine, driving the grasshoppers on with a cord of whips. Famine and the grasshoppers appear in shades of pale green, the color of the fourth horse of the apocalypse, which death rides over the earth to kill with sword, famine, and pestilence, and by the wild animals of the earth. And that's from Revelation 6. Only a simple farm fence stands in the way of the horde of Chinese locusts, a critique claiming weakness at US borders and US immigration policy. Similarly, Robert Walter's 1882 novel, A Short and Truthful History of the Taking of California and Oregon by the Chinese in the year AD 1899, tells of the invasion of Chinese workers who take over the West Coast, led by a mysterious Prince Sa, who sails to San Francisco Bay inward through the Golden Gate, which is both the Golden Gate Strait in the San Francisco Bay and an allusion to US identity as a divine and heavenly land. The narrator explicitly states that Prince Sa bore less resemblance to a human being than he did to Satan. And Chinese workers in the novel, who are employed as housekeepers, cooks, and restaurant owners, poison and kill their white employers and patrons up and down the West Coast. The author ends the book by warning his readers that China will take over the United States, and he quotes from the prophecies of Revelation to identify Prince Sa and the threat from the Orient. The last line of the novel declares that, quote, the black dragon has forced the passage of the Golden Gate. The stories now are different about invading immigrants, given different times and different cultures, but the moves of the game are the same. So-called illegal immigrants are portrayed as ruthlessly violent and criminal, taking over American cities, which justifies their capture by ICE and the deployment of troops. I would say that Trump's current administration has gone far beyond the anti-Chinese movements of the 19th and early 20th centuries, and even perhaps beyond the horrors of Operation Wetback and its deportation of hundreds of thousands of Mexican workers in 1954. I venture to say this because not only is the number of deportations rapidly rising, but the technology, transport, and open flouting of habeas corpus and constitutional rights and citizenship in the face of great public and political outcry is unprecedented. I also say this because the spectacle Trump and Director of Homeland Security, or once Director of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, create constantly for public consumption is new territory. This includes videos like the DHS video I showed earlier, as well as Kristi Noem's photo op in front of caged prisoners at CCOT. Unlike in the past, where these may be published in print news media or broadcast in network TV, these images and words can be posted and reposted on Facebook, X, Blue Sky, Instagram. They appear across the internet. They're discussed and debated on different forums. They can be copied and manipulated, printed on T-shirts, mugs, and bumper stickers. The apocalyptic rhetoric on immigration has become visually and aurally immersive. And that immersive spectacle is an incredibly effective tool in rallying followers and maintaining excitement and belief in what Trump is doing. The spectacle of immigrant suffering and its celebration unites white supremacists, Christian nationalists, and Christian dominion proponents like the New Apostolic Reformation. The exaltation of such groups in the capture and caging of immigrants, refugees, and legal residents and citizens is the phenomenon of scholar Cristina Beltran describes in her book, Cruelty as Citizenship. She writes, "For these groups who yearn for the freedom to police, punish, and exclude, targeting migrants makes them feel stronger, freer, more agentic, transforming acts of racialized violence, whether people are committing, witnessing, or merely describing such acts, into feats of heroism, democratic redemption, civic engagement, and virtuous sovereignty," end quote. And the celebration and spectating of the guarding of the walls and purity of America, the heavenly city, produces a unity and sense of membership in a group that nostalgically valorizes the civic world of the founding fathers when only white, free men were citizens. Beltran states, "Cruelty is not only an experience of community and delight, it's fundamentally a return to a particular civic experience. For those invested in an ideology of whiteness, racial exclusion, violence, and domination produce a sense of membership, creating a common sense understanding of community, opportunity, futurity, and possibility," end quote. And in the American environment of immigration spectacle, people are drawn together as viewers within, watching catastrophe unfold. This phenomena also exists with the New Jerusalem in Revelation, where the narrator sees and describes the suffering of those on earth in highly descriptive speech, where kings and merchants watch from afar the smoke rising from the burning of the whore of Babylon in Revelation 18. It's an echo of the book of Isaiah, where the people of the New Jerusalem go out and look at the dead bodies of the people who have rebelled against God in Isaiah 66. And the voyeurism of Revelation continues through early Christian texts in tours of hell, where sinners suffer their deserved torment. And it continues in Christian writings through the ages, from Augustine to Aquinas to Jonathan Edwards, arguing that those in the New Jerusalem will see those in agonies in hell. The voyeurism of punishment and suffering unites the citizens of the New Jerusalem and gives them, and the readers who identify with them, membership in an exclusive city and proof of their righteousness. In many Christian traditions, the saints watch from heaven and exult in their victory. Since they can't feel pity in heaven, they will instead celebrate God's justice. So Jonathan Edwards preached in New England in 1739, quote, "Every time the saints look upon the damned, it will excite in them a lively and admiring sense of the grace of God. The view of the misery of the damned will double the ardor of the love and gratitude of the saints of heaven," end quote. Indeed, this is why the wall of the New Jerusalem, according to some theologians, has to be see-through, so that the saints can view the punishment of the damned, and the damned can see the glories enjoyed by the citizens of heaven. The Trump wall was also supposed to be see-through, primarily for surveillance. But the view from within America to outside the border is available not only through the steel bollards of the border wall, but also in the constant feed of text and images of travelers at the border, immigrants being chased, apprehended, separated, reunited, flown about. Like the citizens of the New Jerusalem tradition, the US populace is a captive audience to the spectacle of immigration, the catastrophe of immigration now, and currently enmeshed in the disastrous actions in cities like DC, Los Angeles, and Minneapolis. And this great spectacle now points to the many ways America is not like a heavenly city within its own borders. With the nation's attention, political power, and money focused on invasions, deportation, and this lurking enemy, the suffering and crisis of people within the nation increases. Over the last year, the scenes within the borders of the US, the so-called New Jerusalem and City on a Hill, resemble the catastrophe of apocalyptic disasters. That's the danger with prophecies and a book like Revelation. People can use them to justify all sorts of extreme action. And when consequences seem dire or violent, they can say that it's already predestined. Following catastrophic prophecies creates catastrophe. And in fact, some Christian believers celebrate the disasters they see because it reassures them that the end is nigh. They want the end to arrive. For those of us who do not interpret Revelation this way, or do not believe in an end times, besides the ones that human beings are bringing upon themselves, this cycle of self-fulfilling prophecy must end, and so must the equivalence of the United States with God's chosen city and people. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Lin. That was great. And fortunately, Professor Lin has agreed to answer questions and start a little conversation. So, Yii-Jan, can you see the Q&A?
I can.
We have 3 questions so far. They came in right at the beginning of your talk, so I assume there more may come, but we could just start with Gabriel's.
Right. So here, I'm just going to go ahead and read the question.
Exactly, so the audience knows.
Yeah, having read your book and participated in your course last fall, to believe there is an American race. I assume that we're talking about racial construction or of ethnicity. But I would say, is there an American race? I think in the minds of white American nativists who believe that they somehow have a right to this nation, that they would say that it would be a white supremacist understanding of whiteness. In first of all, the default understanding of that racial construction would be of English descent, but beyond that, how whiteness has been racialized and constructed since I'd say from the 1700s onward would be what's understood as that. Is there an American race? No, I don't think. For myself, I would say no, or I would not want there to be, but that would be the answer I think would be given to by white nativists in the US. I have another question from Kirk Davis. Dr. Lin, what is the best translation of Revelation? That's a loaded question. I would say the one that I use in class generally that I've been using is the New Revised Standard Version, the NRSV, and it's has been updated. So there's the updated edition, the NRSV UE, and so that I would say. I know the people and the scholars who are part of that translation, who have given a lot of thought about the translation from the Greek version into the English. And that's one trust. I'm not saying that that's the only one exclusively, but that is the one that I use. And let me see here. I also have from Colonial, also presents that everyone is American, also mentioned in the beginning of your book, the globe is American. So I'm not sure what that question is. Let's see here.
Maybe Brandon's question.
Do white supremacist Christian groups deal with portions of Revelation that present the end times community as international, such as the great multitude in Revelation 7? That is a good question. So yeah, that the book of the great multitude, I mean, the chapter of the great multitude presented in Revelation often is used as kind of a representation of diversity, right? Of people from every nation. And so I don't think, so I think white supremacists, I think it depends. I think the answer can be changed upon what is the most utilitarian and useful answer to that question. So for example, if you want to say, who ultimately belongs, there'll be an emphasis on, the most Christian nation, and that's going to become a white identity in the understanding of some white supremacists. But if you're asking, well, what is the right of missionaries to go and colonize and proselytize in a particular world, they would lean upon the answer of, there needs to be a full number of Gentiles brought in, and the gospel needs to reach the ends of the world, meaning that's justification for colonization. I just think that scripture can be taken to be instrumental for whichever is the purpose, right? If colonization or spread, especially westward expansion, or the takeover of other nations and the takeover of other lands can be viewed as missional and proselytizing in some way justified, then you can lean upon diversity as what you're trying to achieve, to fulfill some sort of prophecy. But you can also lean the other way and talk about exclusion based on a racialized understanding of what Christian is as well, depending on what you're trying to do, and just say that very cynically. Let's see. Someone who tries to be a faithful Christian, how do you recommend responding to this violent misuse of the language of Revelation? I would say Revelation is a dangerous book in this way because, like I've said, it represents end times absolutes, but we're not necessarily living in the end times, right? And what gives us the right to adjudicate and create judgment as God does in the book of Revelation, right? So there's a danger in identifying oneself with, for once, the chosen, and also those who assume that they're getting in. Like, we don't know theologically, right, the answer to those questions. What we are in is the continual living within the community of the human population. And what are instructions given for that, for Christian living? That would come from ethical teachings from Hebrew Bible and the teachings of Jesus and Paul. So I think that it's very dangerous to take something that's theologically meant to understand as an endpoint and apply it to something that right now is not an endpoint, right? And also to assume that we have the power to make those decisions. We don't, right? If you want to follow Christian doctrine, we are not God, right? And we are not judgment in the end times. And so that's not our purview, but living in community is what's being taught ethically in other parts. I would say the vast majority of the other parts of the Christian Bible to turn to. And so that's one way to counteract and to respond to using the book of Revelation in this way. Let's see here. Do you have thoughts on how local pastors can share with congregants the misuse or misunderstanding of Revelation by white nativists? I think that I would say taking a look at the way prophecy is being used in a particular way, or claiming the fulfillment of prophecy, or the fulfillment of end times predictions, and embracing, that dangerous embracing of catastrophe or disaster should be warned against. I think there's a inclination to want to celebrate end times because it imbues our own time with significance, as if we are now in the last stage, and so that makes everything we do now significant. This makes us chronologically important, and everything that happens right now full of meaning. But that's a surety that's not actually given, right? And that you could quote Bible on that, and that it is only God knows the time, and even Jesus rejects knowing the time and place. Only the Father knows. So there's a way to say we can't embrace violent or catastrophic things happening because it's part of some sort of apocalyptic prediction that's coming true, and to point out when that happens in the political rhetoric that's happening, to the claiming of cosmic good against cosmic evil that happens all the time. Stephen Miller leans into that. So do others within the Trump administration, and to single that out and say that's an assumption that's being made in a very confident way that is actually taught against in the Christian Bible. I have another question here. The parallels between MAGA, ultra right-wing Americans and their belief in American racial national purity and unity of those fascist Nazism seems striking. I think anytime we have purity of blood being talked about again in anti-immigrant rhetoric, that's been brought up in the last couple of years. Replacement theory, of the fear of those who are coming in to replace white nativist racial understandings of who actually belongs. That's been part of it. So yes, there's definitely strands of that going back through all these different parts of history, including not just Nazism, but anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish rhetoric throughout American history and European history as well. That's very closely tied in with Christian history through centuries. So that's very much a part of this understanding as well. And the purity of race and blood is a part of that too. And you see that in the fear, you see that in the legal system of America very, very clearly. We had anti-miscegenous laws against marriage of any white person with a non-white person up until Virginia versus Loving in the Supreme Court. So this is all very recent history, which is quite disturbing. Why we might think of ourselves in, a more enlightened part of history, but actually that's pretty recent. So we do see that happening. Here I gather Luther and other theologians had misgivings about the inclusion of Revelation in the canon. What are the resources available within our tradition to counteract any malign influence? I think that Revelation's inclusion, yes, we can see there are many who have had their doubts about this book because of its imagery, because of its extreme violence. And it is just an odd book. Apocalyptic as a genre and an ancient genre is also just a very bizarre and ekphrastic, so very descriptive, highly image-focused, spectacle-focused book. And so, yes, it has lent itself to these particular uses. I think, unfortunately, people can interpret Bible however they want, right? We claim that freedom. Everyone has that freedom. I think what needs to happen, though, is what are the ethical applications and practices that are put in place that we can insist upon as an interpretive community, right? Everyone has their interpretation, and every interpretation, everyone has the freedom to do that, right? But how we operate together as a society and what gets privileged to be put into practice is another question altogether. And I would say that is scripture the foundation for that, or is there an ethical practice that we can all subscribe to that doesn't have to lean upon Bible? Is another big question, right, for thinking about governance in a nation like the United States. And that's a live question right now, and thinking about what should be a foundation and how do we take what texts get to be canonized as sacred and part of our civic understanding. Should it be Christian Bible when we are actually in a nation that doesn't have supposedly, right, a religion as its state religion? If it doesn't, then how do we ethically actually fulfill that? And that includes the book of Revelation as well. It's unsettling how Christian fundamentalists weaponize apocalypse symbology. I'm curious, have you considered doing another presentation about the conflict in the Middle East? And it's can of worms, yes, and it is a touchy subject. It is important to reveal rather to avoid or conceal these complex topics. Yeah, so I think one big thing that is operating here that I named very briefly in my mention of the Civil War is the understanding of Zion, right? And so Zionism and understanding of promised land is at play, definitely an American understanding of itself, right? Thinking about the founding fathers, the Puritans, their errand to the wilderness. It's imbued with promised land and Exodus, Israelite versus Canaanite language. And in other places, I've said that really the colonization of America and also Western expansion was a way for Christians of that time and of our time now to live action role play what they see in the Bible, to reenact what they think Israel was doing, to reenact what's happening in Revelation. And that's a chance to get to play the heroes within those very texts. And I think that's also true of some of what's happening in the Middle East too, is like a claiming from thousands-year-old texts a particular political situation, which is incredibly dangerous and, as we see, incredibly violent, because it justifies through biblical justification and divine fiat those sorts of things. And I do think that's very much a part of that. Yeah, I mean, I haven't made the study of the Middle East and that conflict my own expertise, but there are many who are and have written, especially in terms of perspective of Hebrew Bible scholarship and thinking about promised land and what people groups belong, and what language we're using, what names of people we're using, that have been taken and for politically intentional ways to name geography, to name people groups. That's very much Bible based, and I think that does need to be discussed. Okay, we often pray on earth as it is in heaven. So I meant to ask, what should characterize heaven on earth? That's interesting. So yeah, what I've been speaking on in terms of apocalyptic is thinking about a type of thoroughgoing eschatology. And for those of you who've taken theology, know it's the understanding that these, we can understand these prophecies as, and this descent of heaven as, a very literal understanding of chronology, meaning we're waiting for the coming eschaton and these events are actually going to happen, as versus something like a realized eschatology, which is the kingdom of heaven is among us and that we are living within the age of God's reign, that it's not some futurity that we're waiting for and that predictions and prophecies need to be fulfilled, but actually this holy community on earth right now is and should be, as much as we can, right, heaven on earth. And I think that's a very constructive way to think about it, to think, what do we see in the New Jerusalem in Revelation 22? We have the healing of hurts, we have the wiping away of the tears, and we have comfort. Why wouldn't we want that now for everybody, right? To think of, is there a way for that kind of ethics that we do find in Revelation, even though it's not, direct, explicit teaching like the Gospels might be, but to also enact that, to say, well, why does it have to be eventually and only exclusive and only for the chosen? Is there a way that the river of life and the 12 trees of life growing along the banks of the river, how can we try to actualize that in a realized eschatology today? And I think that would be really instructive to think about as an ethic of the New Jerusalem that can be something that we strive for here on earth. Do you think tech bros like Thiel actually believe what they teach, or are they using it for cynical benefit? I think that's a great question. I think that can be a both and sort of answer. There is a strange naivete about Thiel sometimes when I hear him talking like that, he does kind of believe, like he is moved by certain philosophers, and he thinks he's very deep on revelation and this kind of thing. Although some of the things he's saying, I'm like, people have said this many times before. Like, I don't see why he can't contextualize himself, but people don't like to do that. But there is like a naivete about like what's actually already been discussed many times about revelation philosophy that he seems to actually authentically believe in. I'm not going to really judge his intention. I think for sure there's a cynical benefit, but why not? Like, if you believe this theologically and you can profit from it, more the better, right? Like, I think that's often what's happening. I mean, they do go to church. They are part of this church that does believe in a type of elitism, and those who will rule and those who are actually productive members of society. And they think of themselves, I think, as having this mantle of power and theological justification, and the true wisdom to be able to discern that Greta Thunberg is the Antichrist or representative of that, and that we are the people who are going to free everybody to be part of a better society. And I do think that their bias is that, of course, they are going to be the benefactors because they believe themselves to be the ones wise enough to do all of this. And unfortunately, they also have the power and the money to enact a lot of what they think theologically might be true.
Maybe we'll do these two more by Richard Burnett.
Yeah, and then we can,
Linda.
yeah, sure. Okay. Can you reflect on the relationships of communities that understand their history as of excessive and relentless suffering with an urge for the apocalyptic? Might you say a word about coding of explanations of these histories of suffering in this literary tradition? I'm not quite sure I understand the question. I think I did talk about at the very end the embrace of catastrophe and disaster as, this is then fulfilling prediction and prophecy. And I think, there's human suffering throughout the centuries, regardless, right? Through all of time, unfortunately. And there is a human desire for significance. We all want to be special, right? And it may be a comforting, even though it's a horrible kind of comfort, to think that the catastrophe you're experiencing, the war that your nation is going through, or the violence that your nation is visiting on other people is somehow meaningful, that it's somehow a fulfillment of prediction, a fulfillment of prophecy, so that it's not just empty suffering, but it's productive, right? That it's part of some goal ultimately, that it has some apocalyptic significance. And so that might be one way of saying, because we want to be significant, because we want the times we live in to have meaning and to matter, so that it's not just seen as useless or purposeless, but it's part of a greater prediction and part of a greater salvation history, right, is one way that Christians would put it, as part of that. And so we have seen like the embrace of end times predictions ceaselessly, even though they've been proved wrong over and over again. There's always hope that this one will be correct, right? Or that this time is actually the significant one, or this catastrophe is the one that's talked about. So I think there's like an endless hunger for meaning that hopefully we could direct in a different way. That why does it have to be catastrophe? But what if redemption is, the meaningfulness that can be worked for in that particular way, rather than a nihilistic, almost embrace of apocalyptic prediction. And then lastly, along with the acknowledging that this misappropriation of apocalyptic language is very dangerous, how might Christians individually and corporately who disagree respond, particularly leaders in the church? What role might seminarians like YDS, denominations, and ecumenical coalition play in this response? That is a great question. I don't think I have all the answers. And I do think many of you in the audience do have great ideas, and the communities in the places that you've named would have great ideas of how there could be a response, whether it's through the kind of writings that we write and publish, the kinds of actions that we do. I do think of counter activism against things like these kinds of interpretations of Revelation. So I think of, for example, the history of sanctuary cities. And that is also rooted in biblical interpretation, right? To the understanding of holy sanctuary in a church in a Christian community, in other religious communities also, that the temple in ancient times, whether it was in Greek temples or in Christian churches, offer sanctuary to those who are seeking refuge against those who are pursuing them. That is also coming from Christian ethic and interpretation, right? So there are other ways to counteract this very violent text and interpretation through the histories of those interpretations of what it means to love one another, what it means to lay down your life for somebody else, and what it means to offer sanctuary and to give food and to visit in prison and to care for the least of these. Those are, I think, the texts that this kind of rhetoric has very little to say against when that is the direct teaching of ethics and praxis for the church and for human community in general.
That sounds like good words to end with. How you're handing us some of the responsibility to respond.